Hey, good morning, beloved. Thank you for joining us this morning once again in Sunday Fellowship. We will continue this morning with our study into Romans 5, 6, and 7, and 8. And this morning we are going to continue with Romans 7. Our dear brother Dwight last week hit us with a very, very good message on Romans 7 and his message on the struggle of the two-person identity. And it was very, very good. So I will follow up this week with my portion of Romans 7. And if everything works okay, Brother Curtis will join us next week with his sharing on Romans 7. So anyway, with that, I have a lot of notes on this, but I did not cover all the things I would have liked to cover it in the way I think it should have been, because I've only got so much time, and I really don't want to I'm trying not to do a 2-week message on this, just 1 week, as Dwight and Curtis both have 1 week, although they can do 2 if they want. But anyway, with that said, we are going to proceed with the notes.
Mystery of Spiritual Identity, Dr. Henry Jekyll, Mr. Edward Hyde, Revelation in Romans 7. Romans 7:24, Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Last week, Brother Dwight Davis introduced us to the third leg of our Romans journey to spiritual identity of sonship in chapter 7, leading us into chapter 8. It was quite a powerful message. Today, the Father has purposed to give us insight and contrast into Paul's revelation of one identity, not two natures as some have thought. He is writing about a transition from original identity of the flesh to a spiritual identity in Christ. Paul gives us a look at who we are in Christ spiritually versus what we do in the flesh or body we now live and walk in. He reveals a law at work in our body of this original identity, hindering a peaceful transfer from living in the old flesh identity to learning to live in the new spiritual identity of sonship. This chapter covers some very unique aspects of spiritual identity. Leaving chapter 6, where Paul lays a great foundation concerning our old man or old identity of the flesh, and makes chapter 7 personal concerning himself. Paul gives the readers of the churches in Rome what their new identity looks like up close and personal through himself. His use of personal pronouns in Romans 7 is more extensive than anywhere else. Let me explain. There are 25 verses in Romans chapter 7, and Paul uses personal nouns 48 times. That is almost a 2-to-1 ratio of personal pronouns to verses. There is one other word used more than any other chapter in the book of Romans: law. This word is used 23 times in the same 25 verses. But what law is he referring to in this chapter? I'm going to do something a little different in our message by introducing a famous novel. This novel has a strong reflection of so many believers who struggle with their feelings and emotions of their flesh identities. What's the novel? The novel was written by Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson, first published in 1886. The novel is called Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Background on this
before
classic.
You read the background, let me thank you. You just before we read the background, I want to talk a little bit about this. So before we go into reading the background on the novel, I want to just say a few words about why I chose this novel. This novel came to mind when I was reading Romans 7 some time ago, and I was looking and studying this idea. The Spirit popped it into my mind about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the struggle of one person with an identity crisis. And in his identity crisis, his answer for his identity crisis was to do something to make himself appear to be the person he is, but yet struggle with the pulls of his inward man, his inward identity, as he would say, as the novel will say, his personality. He struggled with that. And I didn't see much difference in what Paul was saying in Romans 7. There was a struggle going on, a struggle between the flesh and the spirit, a struggle between law and grace, a struggle between life and death. So Romans 7 really is a chapter of struggle, the struggle that many people, not just believers, but many people have on who they are to themselves. You take gender identity. There's a struggle. Somebody's struggling with what they feel about being an XY in an XX body, being an XY, not feeling like that's who they are. They feel like they are an XX, or being an XX, feeling like they are an XY. This crisis of identity that flows in the hearts and minds of human beings because of the unfulfilled deepest need that God put in every human being. Every human being has a deep need. Everybody has a great need. Everybody has natural needs, but there's only one part of the humanity that has a need to be fulfilled by God, and that's the spirit of man. So, in this case, we are looking at Romans 7 dealing with a struggle. As Dwight said last week, his message was struggle. The struggle of two identities. But there's not two identities as in two people. There's only one person with a struggle between who he is based on how he feels and the pulls he has. So I saw that the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of emphasized that. Now, I hadn't read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde for years and years and years and years and years. So when I started doing the research on this, I was amazed by the things I didn't remember, didn't even know from that novel of Robert Louis Stevenson. So with that said, I'm going to give you just a little, ask Catherine read just a little synopsis of the whole novel, and then we'll discuss Romans 7, and somewhere in this we're going to intertwine this novel in how this man went about to fix his struggle with the pulls he had of his identity. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Jekyll is a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50 with something of a stylish cast, who occasionally feels he is battling between the good and evil within himself, leading to the struggle between his dual personalities or identities of Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde. He has spent a great part of his life trying to repress evil urges that were not fitting for a man of his stature. He creates a serum or potion in an attempt to separate his hidden evil from his personality. In doing so, Jekyll transformed into the smaller, younger, cruel, remorseless, and evil Hyde. Jekyll has many friends and an amiable personality, but as Hyde he becomes mysterious and violent. As time goes by, Hyde grows in power. After taking the potion repeatedly, he no longer relies upon it to unleash his inner demon, i.e. his alter ego. Eventually, Hyde grows so strong that Jekyll becomes reliant on the potion to remain conscious throughout the book. Jekyll resolved to cease becoming Hyde. Despite this, one night he had a moment of weakness and drank the potion, or the serum. Hyde, his desires having been caged for so long, killed Kenebrew. Horrified, Jekyll tried more adamantly to stop the transformations. Then, in early January, he transformed involuntarily while awake. Far from his laboratory and hunted by the police as a murderer, Hyde needed help to avoid capture. Meanwhile, Jekyll's involuntary transformations increased in frequency and required ever larger doses of the serum to reverse. It was one of these transformations that caused Jekyll to slam his window shut on Enfield and Utterson. Realizing he would stay transformed as Hyde, Jekyll wrote out a full account of the events and locked himself in his laboratory with the intent to keep Hyde imprisoned, and as Poole and Utterson smashed down the door to the laboratory, committed suicide by poison. The parallels in the novel to the man in Romans chapter 7. First, before we compare the parallels of the two writings, we need to explain some fundamental things about Paul in this chapter. Because many don't know or understand spiritual birth, they don't know or understand spiritual identity. Many conclude that Paul, in writing of Romans 7, is referring to a time before he was saved. Therefore, his references to sin are before salvation, and he had no struggles with sin of his flesh. Surely, if he was saved and had these struggles, what does that say about me? Many think that the man who wrote at least half of the New Testament would not have these struggles. But he did. Not at the time of the writing, but after he received Christ. Next, he begins the chapter with an identity statement.
Okay, let me interject a little something in this first. I put this in there because most, as I've been around in religion for a while, been around church for a while, most believe that Romans 7 was written when Paul was a non-believer. I mean, he couldn't be a believer and have the things that he said he was doing there. So they reconciled in their mind that Paul was not saved. This was an unsaved time of Paul's life that he was writing about in Romans 7, but that's not what he said. But anyway, that's what they have to do to make religion fit their understanding. Because if he had those struggles as an apostle, as one who wrote most of the New Testament, as we call the New Testament anyway, then what about me? I mean, there would be no hope for me if Paul's writing about himself as a believer, as an apostle. If he's writing about himself as an apostle and he had those struggles, what about me? And I'm not as spiritual as Paul, the thought would go. But Paul, in this chapter, in chapter 7, is confirming a lot of the things he said in chapter 6. Chapter 7 is Paul's personal struggles with the person he was spiritually. That's why when he was in chapter 6, we discussed chapter 6. I talked about it. Dwight talked about it. Chris talked about it. Each one of us talked about chapter 6 in the context of being buried with, being identified with Christ in his death, being identified with Christ in his resurrection. Our old man is crucified. Paul is telling him in Romans 6 who they're not. Well, in Romans 7, he tells them he had some of the struggles that he sensed some of them are going through in Rome, who are believers, who are struggling with their identity as well. Now, he starts by using identity to start Romans 7. Romans 7 starts with an identity statement of him and those he are referring to. So let's look at that, if we will.
Acknowledge who you are in the flesh by what you know. Romans 7:1. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. In this verse he establishes his flesh identity as a Jew who has the law. Then he declares, as long as you live, the law will have dominance over you. Then he confirms the knowledge of the law. Romans 7:2-3. For the woman which hath a husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. This law includes the law of Moses, but also takes into account that same law before Moses. Genesis 12:11-13.
Okay, let me pause. Keep going with that, Jim. Raise it on up. Bring the verse up, and then I'll have Catherine read it after I say. Well, I'll tell you what, Catherine, go ahead and read it first, and then we'll discuss it.
Genesis 12:11-13. And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. Genesis 20:2. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, She is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Romans 7, 4 through 6.
No. That's good. Let's discuss this before we go to up because we in one and two. Let's Jim. That's good. Let me discuss these verses. I put this in there because it says, "I write unto them that know the law." Now, Paul is talking about the Mosaic law, but there's also a law on this idea about a man's as long as her husband lives, she is not free to marry another. Well, that goes back before the law of Moses, and I put this in there because scroll back down just a little bit for me, Jim, if you can. There we go. Thank you. We're looking at. There's a couple of things I saw as I've shared this in the past, but not quite as in detail here. Abraham is traveling. This is Genesis chapter 12. Now, in Genesis chapter 4, as most of you know, God called Abraham out of Ur of Chaldee and said, go to a place that I will show thee, and I will do this, and I will do that, and I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse them that curse thee. And it says Abraham obeyed God, and he left. Well, Abraham is 75 years old here. Sarah is 10 years younger than him, so she's about 65 years old. Now, they're traveling, and I don't know the timeline except between the time here in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham is 75, starting to leave. We don't know how long it took him. He had traveled, because the verses before then says he traveled through Egypt and so forth and so on. So we don't know how long that time was. But I do know that there was something he knew about the law of the land, that if a woman was appealing to another man and he wanted her, he would kill the husband so that she would be free to marry him. That's what Abraham is doing here. When he says, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. In other words, you're beautiful. You're 65 years old, but you don't look 65 like my wife. You don't look 65. Therefore, it shall come to pass that when the Egyptians see thee, that they shall say, this is his wife. This is his wife, and they will kill me. But they're going to save you alive. They're going to keep you alive. Say then that thou art my sister, that I may be well. Look at what Abraham said. That it may be well with me for your sake. It's for your sake, baby. You tell him I'm your sister. This is not really not for me, but it's for you. But anyway, you see there is a law in operation that this man was a part of in that time in history. So if another man liked a woman and he was married, the object was to either fight him or kill him to keep it to take that woman from him. So if Sarah said that she was his sister, then there would be no need to fight. Now he did it. That was for Pharaoh. He did it when he was between 75 and a little older. It wasn't quite 80 yet, I don't think, because in 86 in chapter 15, he had Ishmael at 86 years old. But here he did it again in chapter 20. And I won't go into the details in this, except that God had already promised Abraham in chapter 18. In chapter 18, that he was going to return unto him that time of life, and he was going to have a son, and Sarah laughed. So between chapter 18 and chapter 20 is less than a year. It's really less than a year. But Abraham did the same identical thing then with King Abimelech. The King Abimelech saw Sarah. Now, this is amazing to me. The woman is almost 90 years old, and Abraham is still struggling with how well she looks. So much so that it says Abimelech took her. So even at 90, this woman was a babe. 90 years old. At least Abraham's still worried about dying. Anyway, his struggle with identity is an issue. But anyway, so I'm saying this to emphasize that it's not just the Mosaic law that we're talking about here that Paul is referring to. He's also talking about that law that was there before the Mosaic law came about, that a man is married to another. Now, I researched that, and if any of you have found the time, like Jimmy or Curtis or some of you other guys that really do it, I could not find where the law of Moses indicated, and I had a lot of things about being married, but nothing says that a woman, as long as her husband is alive and she is married to him, she's not free. So that there was no verse, that there was no law, no verses of the law and the prophets, at least that I read, that covered that. So if you find it, I'll be glad to hear from you and bring that to my attention. So Paul started writing them to know the law, and the law says that a woman, as long as her husband is alive, she can't marry another unless she be considered an adulterer. So let's keep going. Thank you, Jim.
Romans 7, 4 through 6. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which were by the law, did work in our members, bodies of flesh and blood, to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, no more dominion over them, that we should serve in newness of spirit, and not in the oldness of the letter, the law of Moses. Again, remember, Paul is writing and speaking to Jews who believed of Jesus, so he is explaining and confirming that they have received an exchange in union from the old letter of the law of sin and death to a new union of the Spirit.
Okay, let me interject something in this right quick before we move on. Paul is speaking to the Jews at Rome who understood the law. He understood that they were believers who had believed in Jesus. Now, some, as I said, I don't know if Dwight said it, but I know I said it the week before, that some who believed in Jesus from Paul's gospel, and some who had believed from Peter's gospel, and maybe a few that were there that believed in Jesus from the preaching of Apollos. But in either case, they had all believed in Jesus, and they were believing Jews in Rome, in these different churches. And so Paul was confirming that they had received an exchange of union from the old letter of the law. He's saying you were bound to that law. You were bound to the law of Moses. But now, which is the law of sin and death, you have a new union in Christ. You have a new union of the Spirit, which Romans 8 calls, which I will talk about here later on, the law of the Spirit of life. But anyway, he said the newness of life, newness of the Spirit. So let's go ahead on, Catherine.
Romans 7, 7 through 13. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust except the law had said, Thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once. But when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment, which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just and good. Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me, by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful.
Okay, good. Let me add a little something here. If you notice in these in 7, what Catherine just read, I think it was 7, 4 through 7 through 13. We see the introduction of sin more in these verses than any other place. Like I said, the second most often used word in Romans 7 is sin. At 25 verses, you got 23 times the word sin is used. And so Paul is making a point here about sin. But he's also making a point here about the law. And so I want you to keep in mind that the law is prevalent, but there is more than one law that's being spoken about in Romans 7. We've all had the idea that the law that Paul's speaking about in Romans 7 is the Mosaic law, but it is not. There is another law at work in Romans 7, and hopefully we'll see that, because that's where the struggle is in human beings. The struggle is between the law, the two laws that attack the mind. There's a law that attacks the mind of men, and that law brings them into captivity. Most of the time, the law of sin and death, but we'll get to that in a minute, because there's some things you need to see. Keep going, please, Catherine.
These verses are where we see the contrast of identities and power which drives them. This is where the door to our novel opens. Let's start by looking at a phrase in these verses. Sin, taking occasion by the commandment. Let's look at the occasion in the Greek. A place from which a movement or attack is made, a base of operations. Metaphor, that by which endeavor is excited and from which it goes forth. That which gives occasion and supplies matter for an undertaking. The incentive, the resources we avail ourselves of in attempting or performing anything. To take occasion, find an incentive. Romans 7, 8, and 11. Paul said that sin needed an occasion, a base of operation to find an incentive. So what is the base of operation and the incentive? Sin's base of operation is the flesh. It is the body of sin, the original identity which has defined who we are to ourselves and to others. The body we know as me. What is the incentive? The commandment. Paul said 6 times in 5 verses the commandment. Each time, except for 2, verses 10 and 11, sin is in union with the commandment. The struggle is on.
Okay, let's look at that for a minute. I never thought about that word when Paul says here, sin taking occasion. I've read that for quite a while. Sin taking occasion. And I never read and rightly divided that word occasion. I didn't think about it. It wasn't something, it was just a word added to the passage, at least what I thought it was. But Paul here seems to have hit onto something that we hadn't seen, at least I hadn't seen before. And that's this word occasion. It says, sin taking occasion. And when I read that the other day, the Spirit pricked me and said, you need to look that word occasion up. You need to look that word of occasion, because it said sin did something. And because sin did something, it had a place that it started. So scroll back up for just 1 minute, please, Jim. It says sin taking occasion. And that word occasion means a base of operation. Find an incentive. Let's go back up just a little bit more to the definition. There we go. There we go. A little bit more, please, Jim. There we go. Yeah, that's it. That's good. It says, which a movement or an attack is made. The word occasion, a place from which a movement or an attack is made, a base of operation. It says, sin taking occasion by the commandment slew me. The attack on Paul, the attack on the minds of people come from a base of operation. And that base of operation, Paul said here, is the commandment. It's the commandment. Paul used that word, the commandment, 6 times. 6 times in 5 verses. And only 4 of those 6 times have the commandment associated with the sin. 4 of those times deal with sin and the commandment. The other 2 times, he's talking about the commandment is holy and just and so forth and so on. But I want to look at that occasion, because that's a place, I think it's in Galatians chapter 5, Paul said, For let not use not your liberty for an occasion to the flesh. You might remember that. I think it's 5:13. Use not your liberty for an occasion to the flesh. Use not your liberty for a base of operation for your flesh. Use not your liberty for an attack made in the flesh. So I hadn't seen that word occasion was a fundamental part of what Paul was saying in this particular chapter. So it's sin taking occasion, sin making an attack from the commandment. Now I want to just reflect just a minute. Genesis chapter 2, God goes to Adam and he says, of all the trees in the garden thou shalt eat, except of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For the day thou shalt eat of it, thou shalt surely die. We all know that verse. Now, Paul said in verse 9, which Catherine just read, he said that I was alive once without the law, but when the law came, sin revived and I died. What does that mean? 2:16. Thou shalt not eat of all the trees in the garden, thou shalt eat, except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For the day thou shalt have eaten it, thou shalt surely die. What did God just do? Provided a place for a decision. Now, there's a lot more into that. I was reading that again this week as I was studying. That's some meat on the bones, as David told us on Friday. There's a lot of meat on that bone that we're not going to try to resolve here today. But I just wanted to show you that 7:9, I was alive once without the law, is equivalent to Genesis 2:16. Adam was alive without the law. But when the commandment came, thou shalt not, sin revived and I died, which is in Genesis chapter 3, at least on Adam's case. So I wanted to touch that to let you guys know that there's a place. Sin cannot operate in your flesh without something that gives it the authority or the place that it starts from. And here Paul is saying sin taking occasion, sin attacking us by the commandment. Now, you would think that's let's look at the notes. Let's continue. Yep, continue with Romans.
Romans 7:4-21. For we have known that the law is spiritual, and I am fleshly, sold by the sin. For what I am doing I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice.
Now the word practice means live. That Paul said, for what I will to do, in other words, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing, but that I do not practice. I do not live. In other words, you don't live the things you want to live. You don't live the person you want to live. You live outside of that person. So he's saying, I don't practice that, which I know I should be. What I am doing, I do not understand, and what I will do, that do I not. I do not practice. Keep going.
But what I hate, that I do. If, then, I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it.
Wait. How do you agree? Let's give me a corner, please, Jim. How do you agree that the law is good when you're disobedient? Look at that. Paul said this, I do what I will not do. I agree with the law that is good. So what does that mean, Catherine? In other words, James said this in James chapter 4, I think it's 4:16. James says, he that knoweth to do good and doeth not, to him is sin. So Paul is saying here, if I know what I should do and I'm not doing it, then I'm saying there is some good, and that good is the law. I agree that the law is good. Why? Because I'm not doing it. I'm making a decision opposite that. You follow? If you know if you jump in the water, you're going to get wet, you are acknowledging the water is wet. You follow? So that's what he means. I agree with the law that it is good if I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. If I do what I will not do, then I'm saying that the law is good and what I'm doing is not good. Okay? Let's go. Verse 17.
But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find.
Now look at that little line in verse 18. He says this, for I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. So at that little line tells us that the law is good. He's living in something or operating in something that is not good, and he said the law is good. So I agree that the law is good because what I'm doing is nothing good dwells in my flesh. So if I do anything in my flesh, it is not good. It does not agree. I mean, I agree that the law is good and my flesh is not. And well, that's okay. We'll get to that in a minute. Keep reading, please.
To perform what is good I do not find.
Now go back to for the will.
For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. Can't walk in it.
Okay, let me interject something in here. This is important that you understand something in the struggle. You cannot rely on your will. People always say, well, he's just a strong-willed person, and you just need willpower. How many times you heard that? Have you heard that, honey? You just need willpower. You ever heard that, Steve? Willpower. You just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You need willpower. But Paul said this, that's going to fail. For the will is present with me. In other words, I have a will. I have a strong willpower to do what's right. I have a strong willpower to live as a son of God. But, as we used to say back 3 or 4 years ago with Curtis, but to perform what is good, I find not. In other words, I can't walk in it. So your willpower is a trap door. It is a trap door. Do not rely on your will because it's attached to your flesh. I'm not talking about John 5 where Jesus said, I come not to do my will but the will of my Father. I'm not talking about that. He had already submitted his will to the will of the Father. There was only one will he operated by. But most human beings, most of you, some of you, don't operate that way. You still stuck in your own will. You still got your own truth. So he said, for the will is present with me. I have a strong intent. But I can't make that work. I cannot make it work in my struggle to live spiritually. I just can't make that work. What do I need to do? Oh, wretched, well, what do I need to do? What is it I'm missing here? To perform that which is good, I do not find. With strong will, with strong things, with strong beliefs, with all of that, it doesn't work. Let me say it again. It does not work. Keep going.
For the good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice or walk in. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. Now,
let me pause with that one. Paul just put in an exit ramp here. He gave you an exit ramp. He's leading somewhere. He's there, but he's got an exit ramp. And that exit ramp is, okay, it's not I'm that's doing it, But is sin moving me in the flesh? Listen to what I'm saying. Is sin moving me in the flesh? Is sin moving me in the old identity? Is sin, the body of sin, moving me to become a sinning body? It's the body of sin moving me. My will is not enough. Because my mind, which we'll get to in a few minutes, my mind is stronger than my will. My mind has been taken hostage by my flesh identity. And that's the only identity that controls me. Some of us have been living the way we live the whole time we've been on the planet. Even though we've been born again, even though we got, quote, Christ in us, or me and Jesus, or even our identity as a spiritual son of God. But we have these pulls. We have the pulls that we're going to get to in a minute. We have these pulls that keep us locked and loaded, ready to fire into flesh identity. We have that, and it pulls at you. It pulls at some of us. We grew up in a certain way. We had a certain family structure. No matter whether it was a broken, an incomplete family structure, or parents that stayed together for 50 years, it does not matter. That pattern in the flesh, in the body of sin, drives our identity, that creates a struggle for who we are, who we say we are spiritually. God, Jim, I must be getting loud here. I can hear myself echo in the room. So Paul says, it is no longer I that doeth it, but sin that dwells in me. Me where? Where does that dwell?
In my flesh.
In his flesh, in the body he lives in, the body of sin. The body you were born with is your issue. Your struggle is not with the devil. Your struggle is not with the devil. Your struggle is not with your husband, your wife, your kids, your grandkids, your girlfriend, your boyfriend. None of that's the struggle. The struggle is here. The body you live in. The body you were born in. The one you defend all the time. The one you get in there and take a shower with, take a bath with. The one you dress. The one you put smell good stuff on. Keep it from smelling bad. Paul said, no longer I. It is no longer I who doeth it, but the body of sin that I live in. Keep reading. Let's do verse 21.
I find then a law, that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. Note, Romans 6:12-19-20. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that ye should obey it in the lust thereof.
Now, this is Romans 6. That's why I said Paul made Romans 6. He gave all this in Romans 6. Now he's making it personal. He's making it personal now. He's saying, okay, I said this for you in Romans 6. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey the lust thereof. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmities of your flesh. I can't read that because it's behind my picture. Read what did it say, Catherine?
For as ye have yielded your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. For when ye were the servants of sin, ye were free from righteousness.
So Paul, again, this is Romans 6, but he's saying the same thing here in Romans 7. Romans 7 says, and Catherine just read, I find another law in my members warring against the law of my mind. You were talking about two different laws here, not two people, not two natures, but a law that struggles The laws that drive identity. Got two different laws, he said. What did he say? I find another law in my members, in the body that you live in, warring against the law of your mind, bringing your mind of who you are into captivity to the law of sin, or the body of sin that you live in. Keep reading, please.
Our novel uses the contrast, Jekyll and Hyde, to explain it this way. Dr. Jekyll is a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50 and somewhat of a slyish cast, who occasionally feels he is battling between the good and evil within himself, leading to the struggle between his dual personalities or identities of Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde. He has spent a great part of his life trying to repress evil urges that were not fitting for a man of his stature. He creates a serum or potion in an attempt to separate his hidden evil from his personality.
But wait, he's trying not to live after the flesh. He wants to be good. He wants to be good. He, as Paul just said, the good that I would, I don't. But this is the contrast here. He spends most of his life repressing, trying to repress the evil urges that were not fitting for a man of his stature. I call myself a Christian. Everybody does that these days. Everybody calls themselves a Christian. Everybody calls themselves this or that. Everybody got an identity that they're using. But remember, that identity is always in contrast to the true identity that God sees spiritually. Keep going, Catherine.
In so doing, Jekyll transformed into the smaller, younger, cruel, remorseless, and evil Hyde. Jekyll has many friends and
Whoa. Go back to he created a serum, please.
He created a serum or potion in an attempt to separate this hidden evil from his personality.
People do that. You might do that. You create these things, which I'll get to in a minute. That's okay. Keep going.
In so doing, Jekyll transformed into a smaller, younger, cruel, remorseless, and evil Hyde. Jekyll has many friends and an amiable personality, but as Hyde, he becomes mysterious and violent. As time goes by, Hyde grows in power. After taking the potion repeatedly, he no longer relies upon it to unleash his inner demon, alter ego. Eventually, Hyde grows so strong that Jekyll becomes reliant on the potion to remain conscious throughout the book. As we see, Dr. Jekyll seeks to separate himself from the struggle with the evil pulls within. This is not who he sees himself to be. Those pulls do not fit the identity he sees himself to be. He fears others will find out about his evil pulls that have plagued him for years. He tries to fix the problem of his identity crisis. As many do in an identity crisis, he came up with a serum or potion. He created a formula of works, a moral code, a commandment to live by. These things never work for anyone. Sadly, like many who live in their flesh identity, he did not realize these things really cannot fix their identity crisis. It only makes it worse.
Anytime you try to fix an identity crisis by doing something with the same mind or the same body that you live in, you're only going to make it worse. It covers it up. Religion does that. It covers it up. It covers it up. It doesn't resolve the issue. Religion has you going to church more, reading your Bible more, praying more, fasting more. In themselves, there's nothing wrong with any of those. The issue is the reason behind them. And it makes, anytime you add the commandment to that, it makes it worse. Because Paul said the commandment is holy and just, and I am carnal, soul under sin, soul to sin, or by sin. So it only makes it worse. It only empowers that which you're trying to rid yourself of. Keep going, please.
Romans 7, 8, and 11. But sin, seizing the opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of wrong desires.
See that? Paul said the commandment, sin seizing the opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of wrong desires. Again, the law is not your friend. For apart from the law, sin was dead. For sin, seizing opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it I died. He said the commandment, sin through the commandment, deceived me. Paul went on to say in 2 Corinthians, I think it's 2 Corinthians chapter 1 or chapter 2 maybe. I think it's 2 Corinthians chapter 2. Paul said, and as the reading of the Old Testament, a veil still is upon their eyes. Now, many don't see that. I don't think very few preachers, the Bible teachers, and those who follow that idea don't acknowledge that. You cannot acknowledge that verse. Every time the Old Testament is read, a veil comes over. In other words, the mind is deceived. Read that sometimes. Maybe Paul just wrote that down and really didn't mean it. But here he says in 7:11, for sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me. Religion does that through the law, through the Old Testament. I'm not against the Old Testament. Again, I'm clarifying that. There's places, times you need to go there to bring about some things that the Father is teaching us about sonship. But that's not where you draw your life from. That's not where you draw your strength from. That's not where you draw your confidence from. Because nothing he said in the Old Testament to Israel has to do anything with you as a New Testament, as a spiritually birthed son of God. Not a blessed thing. There are no promises. Ephesians 2 tells there are no promises that's given to you. Now, as I said, many of you, or many of people that you know, have their own truth. And that truth is whatever I believe is absolute. It is not. But he said it deceived me, and through it I died. Let's read on, please, Catherine.
Before the serum, there was no Edward Hyde. Dr. Jekyll was deceived by his fear of being seen as an evil or bad person. How many people do you know who have said, I'm not a bad person? The thought of that identity is unacceptable. Dr. Jekyll's mind was deceived. He found himself doing what he did not want to do. He could not control which identity was expressed. Romans 7:22 through 23. For in my inner self I delight in God's law, but I see a different law in the parts of my body.
Pause. Do you see what Paul just did? There's two laws of operation here. One is spiritual and one is flesh. One is spiritual, one is flesh. One comes from the body, one comes from the spirit. So Paul just added two laws, not two identities, not two persons, but a law that that controls an identity. Let me say it again. A law that controls an identity. Keep going.
But I see a different law in the parts of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, and taking me prisoner to the law of sin in the parts of my body. Dr. Jekyll, as Paul, had two laws at work within him. One man struggling with two laws at war in his mind for expressed identity. Two laws were warring for control and right of expression as sin. As him. Galatians 5:17. For the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. A little transliteration of this verse. For the desires of Mr. Edward Hyde are against those of Dr. Henry Jekyll, and the desires of Dr. Jekyll are against those of Mr. Hyde. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. This is the illusion found in the two-person gospel of man-made religion. You know, there is me, then there is Jesus, or me and Christ. In man-made religion, there is always me plus someone else, and there is always a formula or a commandment to decrease one and increase the other. It is an ongoing struggle for control. Yet there's only one person, one identity. Well, then, what is the answer? what is our solution for the struggle for a singular identity? Romans 7:24. What a wretched man I am. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body of death? This novel ends with this series of events. Realizing that he would stay transformed as Hyde, Jekyll wrote out a full account of the events and locked himself in his laboratory with the intent to keep Hyde imprisoned, and, as Poole and Utterson smashed down the door to the laboratory, committed suicide by poison. Dr. Jekyll was completely conformed to Mr. Hyde. He was stuck with an identity he never wanted anyone to see or know as himself. His answer was to lock himself up and imprison that part of him he could no longer control. But when he was found out by his friends, he committed suicide by another potion, a poison. The answer is death to the two-person identity crisis. Romans 6:6-7, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. For he that is dead is freed from sin. Death is the only answer to the two-person identity crisis that many struggle with daily. Man-made religion has no answer for this crisis in Romans 7. As a matter of fact, they promote and encourage the crisis of me plus theology. Our dear brother Curtis said this recently in his message on Romans chapter 6. No religion in the world can exchange you for an entirely new and different spiritual identity. They offer an improved you, a more pious you, a better you that you can live with, but they can never offer an exchange for you. Spiritual birth does not change or improve you. It creates an entirely new species, a species never having been seen before the cross and resurrection. Paul made it clear in both Romans chapter 6 and now in chapter 7, there is only one you that lives, and that identity is spiritual. There is only one law which confirms that identity, the law of the Spirit and the law of sin in the body. Romans 7:6, and now we have ceased from the law, that being dead, in which we were held, so that we may serve in newness of spirit and not in oldness of the letter. Romans 8:2, for the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus did set me free from the law of the sin and of the death.
Okay. I think that's going to do it for this portion of Romans 7 on my end, but I wanted to maybe help confirm some things that you heard last week in Dwight's message or that you've heard before by using a little different scenario in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the struggle of one man with the expression of an identity that did not fit who he was, which was the identity of Edward Hyde. So I hope that this helped you. I trust the Father this helps you. I hope that you'll be able to receive and allow the Holy Spirit to renew your minds to who you are spiritually as a spiritual birth son of the Father. I want to encourage you guys, if you have not subscribed, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll be able to get the messages or know someone who you can refer the messages to. And if you like some of these messages, you can check the like. I say that only because I've come to see that people have come to hear the message of the in Christ message of sonship through others letting them have a YouTube video. But in either case, we trust the Father to send and draw the hungry and the thirsty. So if you're here, you meet one of those two criteria before the Father. And with that said, we thank you guys for joining us this week at Sunday Fellowship, and we trust the Father to see you next week on our next leg of Romans 7. I think Curtis is bringing the message next week. God bless you guys. We love you. Have a great week as the Son of God.